Hello, welcome to Free Bible Commentary with Pastor Teacher Dr. Bob Utley. Be sure to visit Free Bible Commentary at www.freebiblecommentary.org. Now, here's Bob.
We're going to be in Jeremiah 16 tonight. I think it has some very interesting things here. If you don't have an outline, I saw some on a pew back there. You might want to grab you one if you didn't get one. Several times, prophets do things in symbolic action. I always think of the one that tickles me the most is Ezekiel. That guy was a real banana. You know, can you imagine somebody knocking a hole through the side of their house, getting up all their possessions, crawling through the hole to symbolize captivity? He's the guy that laid on his side so many days in his front lawn, then turned over and laid on his other side so many days, representing how many years they'd be in captivity. If you lived next to a pastor like that, you would really be under the gun. You know, have you seen Weird Herman next door? But through their actions, they symbolize truth. Remember Hosea marrying a lady who was unfaithful, and he bought her back, and all of that? Jeremiah is going to present a truth through the very same kind of symbolic action in the beginning verses of chapter 16. Let me set the stage for you. In Jewish life, marriage was the normal state. To be a bachelor Jew was really to be a social outcast. Everybody was married, and they married young. Marriage was considered to be what God had planned for man, and many Jews would get married just to fulfill the law. You know, if nothing else, they'd marry so the law said do it. And God told Jeremiah not to marry. That may not seem shocking to us in our culture, where being single has become an acceptable lifestyle, and I think many people are very happy and content with that, and I'm glad. But for Jeremiah, he was a lonely person to start out with. He had already been alienated from his family and from the people of his hometown and from the priests and the temple. And I'm sure he longed for someone to understand, someone to talk to, some other human being to share his life with. And in chapter 16, God told him not to take a wife, not to have children. Not only that, but God told him not to go to the funeral of his friends and relatives, not to go to any kind of social gathering or party. God seemed to cut him off from every normal social relationship that man could have as far as a support group of friends. You say, well, that seems so cruel. Why would God do that to Jeremiah? Through these symbolic acts of not marrying and not having children, not going to funerals and not going to parties, Jeremiah became the talk of his little town. He became the hermit that nobody seemed to ever be involved in anything that normal people were doing. You see, Jeremiah was saying that God was going to bring judgment on Judah, that the normal relationships of life were about to be broken and cut asunder. And he embodied that truth of the devastation of the exile in his own social life. Now, this is probably one reason why Jeremiah talked so honestly and openly to God, because he had no one else to talk to. Baruch was there sometime, but he was kind of a flake himself. And I think the turning theologically from corporate worship to individual worship happens in Jeremiah because he's so socially cut off from everybody else. Let me read it to you. The word of the Lord came to me, saying, You shall not take a wife for yourself, nor have sons or daughters in this place. For thus says the Lord concerning the sons and daughters born in this place, and concerning their mothers that bare them and their fathers who begot them in this land, they will die deadly diseases. They will not be lamented or buried. They will be as dung on the surface of the ground, and come to an end by the sword and famine. And their carcasses shall become food for the birds of the sky and for the beasts of the earth. My soul! Now you may sit there in your comfortable pew and happy lifestyle and not realize the devastation that Jeremiah was saying. It'd be like someone walking in here and saying, before the sun goes down tomorrow, every one of you will be dead. Your house will be empty. You'll be lying dead in your own homes, and your children will be lying dead with you, and you'll sit there and rot. That'd knock you between the eyes. It's exactly what it did to the people of Jeremiah's day. They hated Jeremiah because of what he preached. They considered him a false prophet because the rest of the preachers were preaching prosperity, abundance. Only Jeremiah was preaching destruction, judgment. Now I want you to notice when it mentions here, is there any possibility, have you ever struggled with the book of 1 Corinthians about Paul's views of marriage? 1 Corinthians 7, oh, it's a jewel of of not understandability, I think. You know, that's the place where he says, well, it's better to marry than to burn. And if you daddies just decide your daughters shouldn't marry and remain virgins, well, you're doing the best thing for them. Now, can you hear an uprising today if daddies decided to tell their daughters you can't marry? Golly. You think there's any relation between Jeremiah 16 and 1 Corinthians 7? I think there really is. Jeremiah knew that the social structure, the social fabric of life was about to be ripped, and God told Jeremiah to stay single because He knew the heartbreak of a man with a wife and children and parents to take care of when exile came. Couldn't provide, couldn't protect, nothing. Paul said, the Lord is coming soon. We need to be active right now. Don't marry because there's not time for social fabric. There's not time for social things. I really think there's a real connection between 1 Corinthians 7 and Jeremiah 16. I want you to think about that. Now, in verse 4, it talks about they will not be lamented or buried. To a Jew, that was a horror. Matter of fact, one of the interesting passages in the book of Deuteronomy 21:23, that deals with Jesus being cursed because He was hung on a cross in open public shame, was that the land was polluted by dead bodies. That's why it was so horrible for a body not to be buried, because symbolically it polluted the whole land. But here's a land full of corpses and no one left to bury them. Now, you might want to see chapter 15, verse 3 for a parallel passage. The deals about the birds being eating the bodies and the beasts of the earth eating the bodies are part of the covenant curses in the book of Deuteronomy, chapters 28, 26 specifically. This was what, when Joshua crossed the promised land, he fulfilled these curses and blessings by part of the Levites getting up on Mount Gezerim and part of the Levites getting up on Mount Ebal with the valley of it was Shechem in it down below, and one side sang the curses and one side sang the blessings if they were faithful to the keeping the covenant. And of course, what Jeremiah is saying is, you have not been faithful, and the curses are now coming into reality. Now, this idea about the birds eating the flesh and the beast, this is a common theme in all the Old Testament about judgment, and it's used apocalyptically in the New Testament. Now, notice where, beginning a new paragraph then in verse 5, it says, "For thus saith the Lord, do not enter the house of mourning." Now, does any of the translation have something besides mourning there? Do any of you have feasting there? What translation is that? You have grief? Okay. The word here has an Aramaic equivalent, and the Aramaic equivalent is the mourning, not mourning like sunrise, but mourning like grief feast. It seems like that what the Jewish mourning customs were as far as a funeral, that the family would fast the morning of the funeral, which would be the next day because they buried him quick. They would fast till the burial, about noon. Then family and friends would bring food in for them to eat, and it'd be a large family meal. Isn't that much the same thing we do today with families? Provide that meal for them. Jeremiah couldn't even go to the funeral meal. Now, don't you know his own family wondered, where's Jeremiah? Why isn't he here? But not just there. Do not lament or console them. He could not even console his own friends and family when a loved one died. Let me go on. For I withdraw my peace from this people, declares the Lord, my loving kindness and my compassion. I can't think of a more devastating verse in the world unless it's somewhere in the first 3 chapters of Romans where God says, I gave them up to their own ways. When God says, I've taken away my shalom, my peace, that is the absence of bad and the presence of good, God took that from them. God took the second thing, His loving kindness. That's the word hesed. That's the word that means God's unconditional covenant love, God's covenant loyalty. Gone. The covenant's broken. God has pulled Himself back from His obligations. And finally, the word compassion, or mercies, tender mercies maybe. God says, I'm taking my peace away, I'm taking my love away, I'm taking my presence away. And the fact that you can't have any part of this social life, Jeremiah, is to show them that. Golly, what a devastating verse. But that he goes on. Both great men and small will die in this land. They will not be buried, they will not be lamented, nor will anyone gash himself or shave his head for them. Now these seem to be mourning rites of the pagan neighbors around Israel that Israel assimilated into her own practices. If we go back to Deuteronomy 14:1, it says, do not gash yourself or shave your head for the dead. The only other accounts we have of this, we have several. Let me give some to you. I think I have them all listed in your outline there. It's mentioned in Leviticus 19:28, 21:5, Jeremiah 41:5, and 47:5. Okay? Now, to shave the head, for a Jew, you couldn't even trim your beard, much less shave your head. The idea of gashing yourself. Remember when Elijah was on Mount Carmel and the prophets of Baal were trying to get Baal's attention to the sacrifice, and they were cutting themselves and screaming? Exactly what the meaning of gashing themselves is, we do not know. Some think it means to tattoo. And of course, tattoo was involved in magic and pagan rites from as far back as we know. So exactly what it is, we're not sure. But God's people shouldn't have been shouldn't have been doing it, but they were. Now Jeremiah doesn't condemn it here. He just says, do not be a part of this. Now it's not saying these are bad practices in Jeremiah. It is in Deuteronomy. Here it's just saying don't be a part of any normal social mourning or grief. Wow. And the next phrase is unusual. Neither will men, now King James has, break themselves in mourning. Now if you look at a modern translation, it'll say break, and it'll have bread in italics. You see that in italics, the word bread? It means it's not in the Hebrew. The Masoretic has break themselves. The Septuagint has bread, break bread. And it seems to be a reference in context to this meal brought into the family and friends. And so it's saying don't eat with them. And then it goes on. Don't comfort anyone for the dead, nor give them the cup of consolation to drink. Now this breaking bread, I'll give you two references, and I think it refers to one or two things. Deuteronomy 26:14 and Ezekiel 24:17. We know from archaeological discoveries that many graves in the Near East have petrified or preserved food buried with the dead. It is a normal custom in India that you continue to take food to the grave of your parents and loved ones, and you put bread and food there which they are to eat. Now it may be saying, Jeremiah, don't take food to the dead. Or it may be saying, don't eat with the family of those who have died. Now which it is, I'm not sure, but both fit. The cup of consolation is a cup in later rabbinic Judaism was a special mixture of water with a little bit of the dirt from the grave. Oh, yuck. And they would drink that as a kind of a way of identifying with the dead one. What it means here, this is the only place it's mentioned in the Old Testament, and we have no idea what it is, but it seems to be a cup of some kind of drink offered to the family of those who have died. But I can't be certain of that. This idea about offering food for the dead. Does anybody here have a Catholic Bible that has the Apocrypha in it? In the book of Tobit, chapter 4, verse 17, it mentions specifically offering food to the dead, but nowhere in the canon that we accept. Now, look at verse 8. Moreover, you shall not go into a house of feasting to sit with them, to eat and drink. Couldn't go to any normal social gatherings, like a wedding feast. Couldn't go. No block parties for Jeremiah. He had to sit home. Can you imagine what God had denied this fellow? All social support is gone. There is no support systems. Now, verse 9. For thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, Behold, I am going to eliminate from this place, before your eyes and in your time, the voice of rejoicing, the voice of gladness, the voice of the groom, and the voice of the bride. He's saying the social fabric's about to be ripped, and I've asked you symbolically to live a very austere and celibate life, Jeremiah, because it's coming. And verse 10, I think verse 10 is an unbelievable verse. And I want to read it, and you see if it hits you with the impact that if you've been here these nights while Jeremiah has preached to these people and preached to them and preached to them, just imagine them answering him with verse 10. Now it will come about when you tell this people all these words, they will say to you, For what reason has the Lord declared all this great calamity against us? And what is our iniquity? And what is our sin which we have committed against the Lord our God? Now there's one or two things here. This is irony. He's really tongue-in-cheek, like they couldn't ask that if they wanted to. They knew what the problem was. It may be irony. But if it's not irony, it's even worse. If they really didn't know what the problem was, that is worse than them trying to play games. If they really did not understand how far they had gone from the worship of God, if they did not understand how polluted they were with idols and wickedness and injustice and oppression of the poor, if they didn't understand that, it's far worse than irony. They had totally missed the ethical nature of the God they claimed to worship and thought all they had to do was go through a few little rituals, a few little sacrifices, a few little prayers, and everything was fine. That's a far worse state. They were so blinded by ritual, they missed the relationship. I think there's many folks in our day who would are going to ask this question to God. God, why don't you accept me? Why are I going to heaven? And the tragedy is some really do not know that if you don't know Jesus personally, I don't care what else you do, I don't care how many good things, I don't care how much you read your Bible, I don't care what rituals you've gone through, the tragedy is, could this people have had the Old Testament, the prophets, and still not really known the essence of biblical faith, which is personal trust and an ethical lifestyle? Is it possible they really could not know? I think in our day, many people are religious and are lost as a goose. It's exactly what they are here. Now, Jeremiah comes back and gives him two reasons, and I can almost see him throwing a hemorrhage. What? You don't know what you've done. You haven't been listening. Verse 11. Surprise you. Verse 11. The first thing you've done, as you're going to get whackoed for, is because of your forefathers have forsaken me. You say, wait a minute. This sounds like God's punishing them for what their daddies did. Yes, that's very biblical. And let me give you two verses. Exodus 34, 6 and 7. Deuteronomy 5:9. I will visit the sins of the fathers to the third and fourth generation. You say, what in the world does that mean? Does that mean if my daddy does something wrong, that God's going to blast me? No, I think the rest of the Bible couldn't teach that. It teaches individual responsibility, and we'll get to the next verse hits that. But I do think that there is a social corporate guilt. The very fact, and I'll mention a contemporary example, the very fact that we sit in our beautiful stained buildings and let our society becomes so materialistic, godless, perverted, and all the rest says something about who we are. That we have sat down and let this happen to our society, we're going to answer for. Corporate guilt. Secondly, the priorities of our life we pass on to our kids. You know, I remember as a child, I must use an example, but I don't know what else example to use. My mother used to smoke 3 packs of cigarettes every day of the world and told me, now don't you dare smoke. It's bad for your health. Well, I thought, croak. You know, the ashtrays all of my house were full. And here I'm told not to do it. So guess, as a young child, what I picked up. Of course. Have you ever been around parents who cuss like everything and then slap their kids across the mouth for saying something? Dummy. Kids don't learn what you tell them. They learn what they see. They follow the examples and the patterns set for them. The fathers were godless, wicked, idolaters. They were unjust. And the kids picked it up and lived the same kind of lives. So, of course, they're reaping because of their forefathers. Second, in verse 12, is the balance to the corporate guilt. And that is, you too have done evil, even more than your forefathers. For behold, you are each one walking according to the stubbornness of your own evil heart without listening to me. Individual responsibility. Jeremiah 31, Ezekiel 18. Every tub will sit in its own bottom. Everyone will answer to God for themselves. And you know, Jeremiah is the first prophet to begin to emphasize the wickedness of man's heart. It says the stubbornness of your own heart here, but if you'll turn over to chapter 17, verse 9 is a very famous statement about man's heart where it says, the heart is more deceitful than all else. It is desperately sick. Who can understand it? And then chapter 18, verse 12, but I will say, it's hopeless, for we are going to follow our own plans, and each of us will act according to the stubbornness of his own evil heart. Now, the Old Testament Jew, let me retrace that. Rabbinical Judaism does not believe in original sin. They believe in the twin tendencies called the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer HaTov, or the good impulse and the bad impulse. And they would say which one you yield to is the characteristics of your life. But I want to say to you, there is some real good evidence here for the fallenness of man, the evil nature. The propensity of man's heart is on evil. It really is. And so they're following after that. Now, verse 13. So I will hurl you out of this land, to a land which you have not known, neither you nor your fathers. Now look at this last little phrase. And there you will serve other gods day and night. Again, it's irony. They want to be idolatrous. They want to serve gods. They want to have fertility rites. God says, fine, I'll send you to Babylon, and you can do it day and night over there, but you're not doing it in my land. That may be what it means. Or, because of 1 Samuel chapter 26, verse 19, where David is talking, he says, Saul has run me out of the land to serve other gods. Now, David was not an idolater. He was a lot of other things, but he wasn't that. So what it apparently means is that they felt like that if you had to move to another country, somehow you were involved in the religious practices of daily life of that country's deity or gods. And the very fact that they were taken to Babylon meant that they were going to participate somehow in the worship of Marduk and all the other gods of Babylon. That's what David says. If you run me out of the land, I'll get caught up just by being out of the land in the Philistines' worship. And I think that's probably what it's talking about. Now, verse 14 and 15 is a parallel to chapter 23, 7 and 8. Many people think that someone later than Jeremiah got Jeremiah's sermons and put them together. And that might be true, because there's not a logical sequence through here. I've told you that. It's just bits and pieces of sermons that are usually put together by topics. And this seems to break into the context, but I still think it's Jeremiah's. It's just maybe from another sermon brought in here. And look what it says. Therefore, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when it will no longer be said, as the Lord lives. Now that's an oath. God's taken an oath by His own name. When it says as the Lord lives, the name for God is Yahweh, which comes from the Hebrew verb to be, which means the ever-living God. So what He's doing is swearing by His own name. As for my name's sake, or as I live. And here's what He says, okay? Who brought up the sons of Israel out of Egypt, but as the Lord lives, who brought the sons of Israel from the land of the north, and from all the countries where He had banished them, for I will restore them to their own land, which I gave their fathers. It's like He's saying there'll come a day when they won't even talk about the Exodus anymore. They'll talk about return from the exile and praise Me for it, God says. As they talk about the Exodus now, one day they'll talk about the exile. And so it's a beautiful thing of hope right here in the middle. That interpretation is from the Talmud, by the way, so I'm picking that up from Rabbinical Judaism. In verse 16, two groups are mentioned. Now, I want to stop for a minute. I was reading the Ante-Nicene Fathers today, and I was reading Tertullian against Marcion. And in that, he mentions this verse as saying, this verse is predictive prophecy that Jesus will call several fishermen as His apostles. I want you to read verse 16 and tell me who and what is happening in there. Just read it to yourself and tell me, who are the fishermen fishing for and who are the fishermen? Okay? Does a new paragraph start in your Bible at verse 16? Huh? Does anybody have a paragraph that goes from 14 through 16? Or does every translation here begin a new paragraph at 16? It's 16? Okay, we're breaking the thought. There's just two verses of hope. Now see, what Tertullian was doing was saying that the fishermen and the hunters are what? God's representatives bringing the children of Israel back into the land. But that is exactly the opposite from what this means, doesn't it? The hunters and fishermen are the enemies from the north that will not miss one man of Judah to escape God's wrath. The paragraph goes through 18, which deals with God's wrath and paying back. So Tertullian diametrically missed what this verse meant. Totally missed it. That's why we've got to be careful of context. It's so important. Okay? Now, fisherman is a common metaphor for going into captivity. Let me give you a few verses. Ezekiel 12:13, Ezekiel 29:4 and 5, Amos 4:2, Habakkuk 1:14 through 17. Now, the hunters are mentioned in Amos 9:1 through 4 as the captors, the invaders, are going to drag every Jew they can find out of the rocks and take them to captivity. Nobody will escape God's judgment. That's the input of this verse. Now, in verse 17, my eyes are on their ways, they are not hidden from my face, nor is their iniquity concealed. I would say this. There ain't no place you can run from the eyes of God. No place you can hide from your own acts. God knows who you are. God knows what you are. God knows where you are. I heard of V.E. Hill one time talking about people who were out to get him, and he said, I don't really worry about that. He says, because my God knows where they sleep. That's right. Now, but God knows what those people are doing. Verse 18, I will first doubly repay their iniquity. Now, this is not mathematical. God's not giving them twice what they deserve. It's poetical. I would retranslate it just to get the sense. He will pay them adequately, appropriately for their sins. And boy, the exile was that. Notice where that continues with a horrible thought. Because they have polluted my land, they have filled my inheritance with the carcasses of their detestable idols and with their abominations. Now, either that is saying they've offered sacrifices to Baal, and the bodies of those sacrifices have polluted the land, or it's saying the bodies, the image of the idols themselves have polluted the land. You know, just the idol shaped like a human being pollutes the land. Now, which one it is, I don't know. Whether it's the sacrifices offered to them or simply their form as a human being pollutes it. I'm not sure which it is. Now, verse 19 is a beautiful verse. Now, I want to read this to you. I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to, don't look in your reference Bible now. I want you to know if you can tell me the psalm that this comes from. O Lord, my strength and my stronghold, my refuge in the day of distress. To thee the nations will come from the ends of the earth and say, Our fathers have inherited nothing but falsehood, futility, and things of no profit. Can man make gods for himself, and yet they are not gods? What is that so close to? What psalm do those titles for God come from? 18. Oh, I love Psalms 18. Have you seen that thing lately? Listen to the titles of God in Psalms 18. I love Thee, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, my deliverer, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield, and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. Now the words strength and stronghold have the same root. It's the idea of a high, impenetrable tower where it's a fortress no one can scale. Refuge, the same idea, fleeing to a fortress that no one can scale. The tower of God has never been assaulted, never been knocked down. Beautiful picture. Then the universal idea is so beautiful. To thee the nations will come. Implied being the Jews will be back in the land, the temple will be set up again, so there's the restoration of the Jewish nation, and all the nations will flow into that, and they will all say, all the pagans will say, Our fathers have taught us wrong. All our gods are idols are nothing. There is no existence to them. This is an admittance of monotheism, that God is the only God there is, that idols are nothing. They're not even lesser gods like angels. They are nothing. They are vanity. There's no element of truth there. There's no validity there. Nothing there. And in verse 21, Therefore, behold, I am going to make, and notice the number of times the word know is used through here. Make them know. This time I will make them know. My power, my might, they shall know that my name is the Lord. The word know in the Bible speaks of intimate personal relationships. Adam knew Eve, and she conceived. To know someone is not facts about God, not what God, simply things that God is or has done or said, but to know is to come into a relationship with. We come into a relationship by faith. Faith is basically knowing what God has done and that He has been true to His Word. Faith is trusting in the trustworthiness of God and what He does. And my name is the Lord. The word for Lord there is Yahweh, the ever-living God. Exodus, of course, chapter 3. Questions or comments about Jeremiah 16? David. I'll be darned. Implication being they are feeding those who have died. I guess that is an affirmation of life or death, but it is also an affirmation that they're not taken care of, isn't it? You know, the worship of ancestors is a real problem in China today still, in Japan, you know, the veneration of the dead. You know, that In Persia, they let the birds eat the dead. You know, those towers called drachmas, they put the dead up there and let the birds eat them because they're afraid that to bury the dead in the ground will pollute the ground. But the Hebrews have a different idea. And what is that idea? Dust to dust. Folks, I know it sounds gross, but we're just real good fertilizer to keep things going. That's all this body is. Wasn't meant to last, right? I wonder sometimes in our culture, we think we're so civilized. I think our funeral customs are pagan. Do you know that? Spend $2,000 on a dead body to get it right, and then $10,000 on a coffin, and then another $2,000 for something to put the coffin in. To me, it bothers me. You know? And then to put $500 of flowers around it bothers me more. If you want to love somebody, why don't you love them when they're alive? You can't do anything once they're dead. Funerals are basically for us, and they have become egocentrical in their extravagance. Think about that. I can't ever talk about that when a death occurs because it's just not appropriate. But I can talk about it now because we're not in the context of any of you dying.